Boa tarde, pessoal. Eu sou o Marcelo Busato, professor Marcelo Busato da Unicamp, sou coordenador do grupo de pesquisa LiTPos, Linguagem, Tecnologias e Pós-humanismo Humanidades. Hoje a gente está realizando aqui o nosso terceiro colóquio e a gente tem o grande prazer de receber o professor Edward King, da Universidade de Bristol, que é um pesquisador que já esteve no Brasil algumas vezes, já esteve na Unicamp, e que realiza um trabalho que a gente admira muito. Ele é um especialista em América Latina e vai fazer hoje a gentileza de compartilhar um trabalho dele. Depois nós vamos ter trabalhos de dois jovens pesquisadores do LiTPos também, que serão apresentados e debatidos por ele. E eu queria avisar que esse evento todo vai ser gravado e vai ficar disponível no YouTube. Então, Edward, muito obrigado. Deixa eu apresentá-lo aqui. Edward King possui mestrado e doutorado pela Universidade de Cambridge e atualmente é professor associado do Departamento de Estudos Hispânicos, Portugueses e Latino-Americanos da Universidade de Bristol, onde ele ensina e pesquisa no campo de teoria cultural, com foco nas culturas literárias, visuais e digitais contemporâneas. O professor King se interessa especialmente pelo modo como a literatura verbo-visual especulativa da América Latina, por exemplo, os quadrinhos e as novelas gráficas, está relacionada com as dinâmicas de poder da era digital no nosso continente. Interessa ao professor King a natureza da subjetividade no século XXI, em especial o problema das formas de corporificação e mediatização que conectam o ser humano com o seu ambiente não humano. Daí, o professor apoiar-se no pós-humanismo, corrente que ele explorou no volume que escreveu em coautoria já em 2017 para a editora UCL Press, intitulado Pós-humanism and the Graphic Novel in Latin America. No momento, e é disso que ele gentilmente veio falar aqui hoje, o professor King trabalha seu livro intitulado In Twin Being, Twins in Digital, Visual and Literary Cultures. Em 2021, possivelmente o professor estará de novo aqui no Brasil, a depender aí da pandemia, né? Porque nós estamos organizando juntos um workshop internacional financiado pela FAPESP e pelo Conselho Britânico, cuja finalidade é reunir pesquisadores dos dois países para dialogar sobre abordagens interdisciplinares em letramentos digitais e inclusão social. Num tom mais pessoal, conto a vocês que o professor King já morou no Rio de Janeiro, quando mais jovem, e por último, e talvez mais importante, ele é pai de duas meninas pequenas, que são gêmeas, mas que eu suponho que ainda não tirem selfies, né? Edward, seja bem-vindo, muito obrigado, a palavra é sua.
Thank you very much. Yeah, firstly, a huge thank you to Marcelo and Paulo for inviting me to take part in this event. I've been really looking forward to it. Loads of events have been cancelled, so it's great to be involved in one that I can still go ahead with. The last time I spoke at Unicamp was in 2015, I think, and back then I spoke in Portuguese, but unfortunately my Portuguese has got a little bit downhill since then. I just haven't been practicing it as much as I should have done. So I'm going to speak today in English, partly because the research is quite fresh and I sort of need my English in order to navigate it. But please do ask questions in Portuguese and we can conduct the discussion in Portuguese and English and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the ongoing work that I'm going to present today is part of a book project that's provisionally titled, as Marcelo said, Entwined Lives, Twins and Connectivity in Literary, Visual and Digital Cultures. So the book explores the role of twins in contemporary culture to embody the entanglements with technologies and the natural world that have been disavowed by modernity's positioning of the human subject as separate from and superior to the non-human world. So this project sprang from two things. I started working on it a few years ago in around 2016. And the first thing is an ongoing interest in post-humanist theory, dating back to the work I did in preparation for the book Post-humanism and the Graphic Novel in Latin America, which, as Marcelo said, was published in 2017, in which I explore the comics form and the embodied modes of reading that form demands as a vehicle for critical post-humanism, taking that term through Rossi Braidotti's definition, amongst others. So that was, one of the sources of this project. The other was, as Marcelo mentioned as well, becoming a father of twins myself and becoming interested in representations of twinship in popular culture, in kids' books, representations of twins as a problem, usually, as sort of liminal figures, problems who pose a challenge to how society is conceptualized as a collection of individuals. So if that was the kind of, I don't know, emotional starting point to the book, the conceptual starting point is an ambiguity that I noticed in cultural and scientific uses of twins between two tendencies. On the one hand, the use of twins as a scientific instrument for enforcing separations between man and nature. So this is rooted in Francis Galton's twin studies experiments from the end of the 19th century, from the 1870s, in which he used the differences between monozygotic and dizygotic twins to disentangle the influences of culture and nature over human development. So the role of twins in the eugenics movement, the really prominent role of twins in the eugenics movement, of which Galton was one of the founding fathers, entered popular culture through the trope, through the figure of twins as clones. And I know a really good example of this is the book from the 1930s, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I believe there's a TV adaptation recently, which I was going to watch, but then it got terrible reviews, so I just didn't bother. But maybe it's worth it, who knows? So that's one tendency, the use of twins in scientific experiments to reinforce and to examine the separations between man and nature. The second tendency is for twins to become the embodiment of transcorporeal entanglements. I'm using a term there developed by the feminist, eco-feminist critic Stacey Alaimo. And these transcorporeal entanglements are not reducible to the model of the liberal humanist subject. So this mode of representing twins comes primarily through the association between twins and the aesthetic of the uncanny, the Freudian uncanny. For example, in Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, which in many ways provides the paradigm for this motif of the uncanny twins, the bond between two fraternal twins, Madeline and Roderick Usher, constitutes a form of a kind of communications technology that's so powerful it transcends death itself. So Madeline, can communicates with her brother, haunts her brother from beyond the grave. This the twin in this case is a model of the non-modern self, composed in continuous and ongoing relationship with the non-human world. So these are these two tendencies, and these two traditions of representing twins or using twins in scientific research have been deployed in parallel mostly throughout the 19th century. But it became clear to me, the more I read, that this second conception of twins as kind of emblematic of a non-modern self, has risen to prominence at a time like our own, when the myths of individuality and human exceptionalism have been undermined like never before. So this, attack on these two myths has taken place on two main fronts. And these are the two fronts that I'm primarily interested in. Firstly, the displacement of individual actors in favor of socio-technical networks in digital cultures. And secondly, the entanglement of human and non-human agencies revealed by the current climate crisis. So my main argument in the book as a whole is that the entwined being of twins, to use the title, is replacing the kind of bounded being of the individual as the dominant model of subjectivity. So in preparation for this talk, I distributed a kind of work in progress, a draft of a chapter that I'm going to turn my attention to in the second half of this talk. But first, I thought it'd be useful to talk you through some of the other chapters that I've been working on, some of the other sort of case studies for this theory that I've been developing. So first, So I'm going to start with perhaps the theoretical core, the chapter that opens the book. And it's a chapter titled Telepathic Twins and the Mytho Technesis of Cybernetics. And in the chapter, I explore the role played by the idea of twins in the history of cybernetics theory. So in 1951, the British neurobiologist Gray Walter constructed autonomous twin robots called Elmer and Elsie, which he described as these he used the word tortoises to describe them. And if you Google Gray Walter, Elmer and Elsie or tortoises or something like that, there's a great video on YouTube of him. It's a kind of BBC footage from the post-war period of the 50s, with him displaying these robots that are displaying autonomous behavior. And they are really simple robots that are these tortoise-shaped objects with a sensor on the front and also a light bulb. And when they interact with each other, they display behavior that's unprogrammed. It's this kind of glitching dance that they perform around each other. And in his 1953 book, The Living Brain, Gray Walter's book, The Living Brain, he argues that through their interaction with each other, the twin robots display emergent, unprogrammed behavior, thus equating their interactions with those of humans. And if you're interested in this, there's an excellent chapter on Gray Walter in Andrew Pickering's book, The Cybernetic Brain. So in this case, twins are used as a motor, are presented as a motor for autonomous machinic being. Twins also play a key role in another key work of post-war cybernetics theory. That's Norbert Wiener's 1950s book, The Human Use of Human Beings, which is his attempt to popularize post-war cybernetics theory. And in that book, he sets up this thought experiment where he asks us to think about two identical computers with running on completely identical software that over time are fed different information. And the feedback loops of these engenders set them down different developmental paths. So although they start identical, they become very different systems. And he asks us to think of, as proof of this, think about identical twins that start off as genetically identical, but then become through different experiences and the incorporation of those different experiences into their selfhood and into their forms of embodiment, become very, very different individuals. So there's, in a couple of, I think, key instances, twins are deployed at the root of cybernetics theory in the 1950s during the post-war period. And what I do in the chapters, once I've looked at those, I trace the influence of that in the trope, the figure of telepathic twins in post-war science fiction in works such as Robert Heinlein's novel The Time for the Stars, which was published in 1956, Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human, which is from 1954, and the fiction of A.E. Van Voigt from around the same period, or actually slightly earlier. And then at the end of the chapter, I explore how Philip K. Dick mobilizes the trope of the lost twin in his writings and his kind of mythological world that he developed. Because twins are central to his work. He often in interviews refers to a period in his youth when he had a twin sister who died as a baby. And he describes it as a kind of founding moment of trauma in his life that he returns to over and over again. And in many works of his, there are twins. And in these worlds, twins perform for each other the function of what I describe as, what I think of as transitional objects, in the sense that Bernard Stiegler developed that term in his book, What Makes Life Worth Living, which is from 2013. And he develops it himself from the work of D.W. Winnicott. So twins often perform for each other the role of figures who are both external and internal at the same time, in the same ways that technologies occupy an ambiguous liminal state between the inside and the outside of our conceptions of selfhood. So in another chapter, I look at the horror genre, twins in the horror genre, and I examine the role of twins as a form of weird mediation in horror fiction, and also films and fiction that draw on the horror genre in significant ways. So we've already looked at how in Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, twins, the fraternal twins, embody a form of kind of human communication. They constitute this human communications technologies that's incredibly powerful, since it can transcend the barriers between life and death. But in more recent horror, twins more often, I think, constitute a form of blocked communication. So rather than the kind of hyper connection that we see in Poe's deployment of this, the uncanny trope, we see a form of blocked, uncomfortable communication. And the paradigm for this is provided, I think, by H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Dunwich Horror, in which one of the characters, a character called Wilbur, opens up a portal into this monstrous other world for his kind of monstrous twin. And this other world is presented as totally unthinkable, beyond the realms of thought, and therefore this kind of blockage to thought. And this, I think, has been influential in a number of recent or recent-ish films from the latter half of the 20th century. So, for example, the melancholy twins in Peter Greenaway's 1985 film A Z and Two Noughts, and David Cronenberg's 1989 film Dead Ringers, for instance, present twins as a form of weird mediation that blocks the scopic regime of modernity while conjoining realms kept separate by this regime, such as life and death, organic and inorganic, animate and inanimate. I urge you to watch Peter Greenaway's very, very weird film, A Z and Two Noughts from 1985. The main characters are twin brothers who were conjoined and separated as babies, who work in a zoo, and they're both fascinated with processes of decay and are scientific, and examining processes of decay in the animals in the zoo, in deploying scientific means to study them. And what happens, they over the course of the film, they gradually turn inwards. They metaphorically, at least, conjoin with one another. And the final scene is when they try and study in a scientific way their own decay. So they take poison, rig up these elaborate camera systems to record their own death and decay. But the final scene, there's a short circuit and the whole machinery explodes and burns. And so that recording never actually takes place. So their twinship functions as this blockage in that scopic regime of technoscience. The third chapter is titled Ecologies of Twinning, and in it I explore the role of twins in ecological theory and climate change fiction. So this is the chapter that's probably the least connected with the theory of the seminar, but I thought, with the topic of the seminar, but I thought it was worth talking through anyway. The chapter explores two dimensions of the role of twins in the myths of climate crisis. So the first is the figure of impossible twins, developed by anthropologist Eduardo Viveiro de Castro in his account of what he describes as Amerindian perspectivalism. So central to this theory is his retelling of Levi-Strauss through his book from the 1990s, The Story of Lynx. And in that book, Viveiro de Castro argues, twins are presented as a model not of stable dualism, but of a dynamic disequilibrium, which is Levi-Strauss's phrase that Viveiro de Castro kind of clings onto, which is the very motor of life. So I start off by examining the role of twins as an embodiment of dynamic disequilibrium that exists between nature and culture, man and nature. Then I move on to look at how twins are used to conceptualize non-anthropocentric alternatives to the dominant temporalities of modernity, temporalities that are compelled by our thinking of the climate crisis. I do this through a reading of the novel Half-Life by Shelley Jackson. which was published in the early 2000s, I think. The way the book is told is really interesting because it's told by primarily by one conjoined twin, and then at the end of the book, whilst her conjoined sister is asleep on her shoulder, as it were, and then at the end of the book, her twin wakes up and takes over the narration of the book. And then we discover retrospectively that the book is actually this kind of Möbius strip-shaped temporal loop, in that the beginning, the end brings you right back to the beginning again. So both twins are narrating their stories in a kind of endless loop. So again, twinship, the modes of temporality they compel us to think about are presented as ways of conceptualizing the Anthropocene. Twinship is mobilized in constructing an imaginary of what Catherine Yusof describes as an environmental relation to come, one that does not take as its foundation the myth of liberal individualism. In the final chapter, before we move on to talk about the draft chapter that I distributed before this talk. So the final chapter is titled Twinning in Black Futurism, and in it I explore the role of twins in Afrofuturist aesthetics. So there's a long history in North American literature and beyond of separated twins being used to scrutinize the agency of race and racism in the reproduction of social inequalities. These include, for example, Toni Morrison's 1998 novel Paradise, and the recent book The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which came out last year to some acclaim. But more recently, I argue, the trope of Afrofuturist twinning, so twins deployed in the context of Afrofuturist aesthetics, has been used to speculate about emerging transcorporeal configurations of information and media. And in the chapter, I explore this through an analysis of artists and authors of speculative fiction, such as the French dance duo Les Twins, Tade Thompson and his excellent trilogy, science fiction trilogy, the Rosewater trilogy, which I'm not sure if it's been translated into Portuguese yet, but if it has, please read it, it's excellent. And Nalo Hopkinson's novel Sister Mine. It's worth, if you've got a moment at some stage, to watch a couple of videos by Les Twins, because one of my arguments, there seems to be this striking sort of parallel or echo between their dance technique, in which they use twinship as a key motif by riffing off each other, mirroring each other, and so on. It's like a kind of glitch dance version of Gray Walter's robots for the 1950s. And one of the things I argue in the chapter is that twinship, the bond that exists between twins, is used by these dancers as a technology of the self that undertakes a transformative becoming. So they use their dance to present a form of selfhood that is in a constant state of mutual becoming. That's a state of becoming that exists between both of them in the context of the music rather than individually. Okay. I hope you're all still with me and following me. That's so far what I've been doing is giving an overview of the project itself, the Entwined Being project, and giving some details about the contents of some of the individual arguments and the case studies that I'm exploring within the book. What I'm going to do now is talk a little bit more about the work that I distributed in quite rough draft form in advance of this session. And this I'm envisaging as being the last chapter of the book, although, as I say, it's still very much a work in progress. It's titled Twin Faces in Algorithmic Image Cultures. And so my starting point for this section was the release of the Apple iPhone X in November 2017, which had a new a new security system that used facial recognition technology rather than touch technology, and it was set to introduce that technology in all subsequent ranges of iPhones. And shortly after this was released, or exactly when it was released, a ton of identical twin YouTube and social media stars decided to test it on their twin faces. So yeah, identical twin social media stars is a thing. There are tons out there who use their twinship, the fact that they're identical twins, as a key part of their brand. And it's something that during my research for this book, I became increasingly interested in. So when the Apple iPhone released their Face ID technology, they leapt on it as something to, because they often, in their YouTube videos, they often do sort of amateur consumer reviews for their followers, etc. So they decided to, in a really gimmicky way, test the system on their twin faces. And they discovered that the system didn't work on their faces. They could unlock each other's phones. So, for example, if you want to Google search for the video, there's one by the Dolan twins, North American identical twin social media stars with kind of massive followings, in which they find a glitch in the Apple system and unlock each other's phones. So watching these videos really made me think of performances of twinship in early modern drama. But while in, for example, Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, the performance of twinship tests the essentialist bias of audience members. In other words, the modern tendency to think of behavior as belonging to individuals rather than events that take place between individuals. The Face ID videos seem to be testing the limitations of emerging biometric systems of control, and doing so in a really interesting way, albeit a kind of unwitting way, perhaps. So the relationship between twinship and these biometric systems of control in these videos is highly ambiguous. So on the one hand, they seem to be reinforcing these systems by, on the one hand, marketing them. The very fact that they're reviewing them on their platform to their millions of viewers makes them extremely desirable for their viewers. But on the other hand, they're using their faces as what you'd call adversarial images to test the algorithm, right? And there are tons of facial recognition systems that are in development that discuss identical twin faces as one of the main, one of the major challenges to their system. And so if you can discern the differences between identical twin faces, you've cracked it, kind of thing. So on the one hand, they're reinforcing these systems, but on the other hand, by introducing blockages, moments of failure into these systems, they're also revealing how they work. So as Jussi Parikka puts it in his book, Digital Contagions, accidents and failures, and this is a quotation from him, reveal technology and the power-knowledge relations that media are embedded in, end quote. So it's this aspect of the videos that I'm really interested in. The performances of twinship as blockages in biometric systems constitute, I think, moments of uncertainty in the datafication of identity, moments that encourage us to rethink the connection between digital data and human individuals. So first, it's worth taking a closer look at these twin Face ID videos because, on the surface, they're extremely frivolous, just trashy content that's thrown out there and to be discarded the next day. But they're surprisingly complex, I think, when you look at them a bit closer. So the Dolan twins video, for example, foregrounds the way in which face recognition systems appeal simultaneously to two different systems of power. On the one hand, they seem to be an extension of the visual economy of disciplinary power and its focus on the individual. The Face ID interface, for instance, evokes the mugshot in its construction of the face as the seat of subjectivity, an anchoring point of individual identity. So it evokes that whole tradition of the use of photographic technologies for the purposes of biometric surveillance. And the false solemnity in the videos that displayed by the YouTube celebrities parodies the disciplinarity of the mugshot and Apple's claims to scientific objectivity. The twins offer themselves to the machinic gaze of the camera as specimens to be characterized in a manner not unlike the twins in Peter Greenaway's film A Z and Two Noughts. But on the other hand, face recognition software is also bound up with another system of power, with the algorithmic systems of categorization that focus not on the individual, but on the pre-individual level of preferences, tendencies, and isolated actions in a way that is reminiscent, at least slightly, of Deleuze's slightly fanciful account of control society from the 1990s. So in many ways, the video is a performance of digital hyperconnectivity, perhaps the one unifying trait of social media stardom. The emphasis of the video is the act of communication itself over and above the actual content of the communication. So it doesn't really matter what these YouTube stars are saying, as long as they're saying stuff. It's all about communicating in this kind of frenzied way. That's why their default affect is one of intensity and ongoingness. So here in these videos, the focus is the act of interfacing with computer systems, something that the Dolans do so efficiently that they can easily access both their own and their siblings' information without encumbrance. So in the process, the twin YouTubers present themselves as the ideal of post-human connectivity. The ubiquitous technologies of digital communication in their videos merely reinforce the sort of natural connectedness hardwired into themselves as twins. So again, it's very reminiscent of the telepathic twins motif of post-war cybernetic science fiction. So the critical function of these videos, their value as an act of sort of unwitting critique, resides in the fact that they enact a hesitation between what photography critics Daniel Rubenstein and Katrina Sluis describe as the incompatible visual logics that are constitutive of algorithmic image cultures. So they argue that algorithmic image cultures are put together, are sort of formed by a tension between two logics that seem to be totally incompatible. On the one hand, there's, and this is a quotation from them, a rational visual representational logic according to which the image on our screen refers to something out there in the universe, a cat, for example. But on the other hand, there's a recursive viral logic of intensity, multiplicity, and incompleteness in which the image refers only to itself, end quote. So while photography retains an aura of representationalism, its claims to be able to represent the world, and is made to speak the language of identity as a consequence, as digitization breaks the chain of signifiers, it also creates an excess or a supplement that is not representational, but sensual and effective. And that's that last clause is Rubenstein and Sluis. So this double logic within algorithmic image cultures serves to reinforce historical identity categories, while simultaneously binding us to algorithmic information systems at a pre-individual kind of affective level. So the more I thought about it, the more I realized that twin stars in these videos embody this double logic. Part of the appeal of twin stardom is that only true fans can tell them apart and identify the real Ethan or Grayson, which is the name, the Christian names of the Dolan twins. In a way that echoes the twin trope in early modern drama, the audience's faith in individual identity is shaken before ultimately being reaffirmed. It's sort of this this exciting challenging of individual identity, but ultimately one that reaffirms it. However, the seemingly double image of the Dolan twins' faces seems to preempt the proliferating decentered logic of the image in networked image cultures. Its undermining of the paradigm of representation in favor of effective intensity. So The role of twin faces is becoming increasingly significant in our contemporary cultural moment, in which the unprecedented prominence of faces in social media, dating apps, security systems, coincides with what the Deleuzian critic Claire Colebrook describes as a cultural loss of face, a disconnect between the human face and individual subjectivity. So this loss of face is being driven in a really paradoxical manner by their sheer abundance in contemporary image cultures, coupled with the increasing accessibility of manipulation software such as face swapping systems behind deep fake videos. So at the very moment where faces are everywhere, you use your faces to access systems. This is all the more the case in the current conditions of lockdown and COVID. Our faith in faces as being representative, as being sort of portals into individual subjectivities, is being eroded. And a closer look at the role of twin faces in contemporary digital cultures exposes this tension in a really interesting way, I think. So I'm going to use another example here. And that is, there's a growing number of apps and websites that offer to find users what they describe as twins by scouring the internet for similar faces. So by twins, they really mean sort of doubles or visual doppelgangers. The website twinstrangers.net, which currently has more than 5 million paying subscribers last time I checked, claims to be able to find your lookalike from anywhere in the world. So what they do is, when you register, their face AI, facial recognition technologies, compares your photo against millions in their database and finds kind of the closest matches. And if two subscribers are matched, they have the option of contacting each other. So there are these really fascinating, well, I think they're fascinating because they're really strange, promotional videos out there. If you Google twin strangers, you'll find them. And in one of them, somebody called Neve tracks down her doppelganger, Karen, using the Twin Strangers software. And there are also 2 follow-up videos showing Neve meeting her second and then her third twin strangers. And in one of these, Neve is told that she not only resembles her lookalike, but that they share a very similar aura, is the word they use. And hearing this news, Eve is kind of overcome by emotion. She breaks down in tears as if she's kind of established this genuine human connection. So the discourse surrounding the Twin Strangers website echoes the ambiguity of the twin social media stars. So on the one hand, it seems to celebrate the cultural loss of face driven by networked image databases, the fact that there are loads of faces out there in the world that all look exactly the same, sort of undermines our faith of the individuality of faces. But on the other hand, it constructs the face as a site of potential ethical communication in a kind of Levinasian sense. The site promises not only to match lookalike users, but also to facilitate a deep interpersonal connection, as is evidenced by Neve's kind of emoting when she meets her twin. So one of the effects of looking at photographic images of twins is that the faces staring back at you take on a kind of mask-like quality, and that is faces of twins who you don't know. This doesn't work with me and my daughters, for example, because I know their faces extremely well. So rather than just the result of monozygosity, the impression of identicalness in many photographic images of twins is the product of a very purposeful performance. In photographic stagings of identical twin identities, the sitters employ a form of mask. The depths of emotional and biological differences are occluded by a surface sameness that is presented to the camera. So an example that I'd like to use is a recent photo book titled Twins by Peter Zielewski, which was published in 2018. And in this book, there's this interesting kind of collusion between the photographer and the photographic subjects in this performance of identicalness. The supposed objective neutrality of the camera seems to be preempted by the deadpan expressions, the sort of affectless expressions of the twins themselves, as they present themselves as specimens that are representative of the human type announced by the book's title. So there's this idea that they're sort of specimens presenting themselves for scrutiny. So one of the reasons for this mask effect may be the fact that with many monozygotic twins, facial expression and movement, the play of emotion through their features, often breaks the spell of identicalness. So it's only when remaining kind of emotionless and affectless does their identicalness come to the fore. So just as the machine vision of the Face ID system conflated Ethan and Grayson's faces, when the human eye confronts a photographic portrait of identical twins for the first time, it tends to move back and forth between the two faces in search of differences on which to anchor itself. And if next time you look at a photographic image of identical twins, for example, Diane Arbus's, Roselle twins from New Jersey from the 1960s, you'll find your eye kind of flicks back and forth in search of similarities and then differences. The gaze skates across the surfaces of the faces presented to Zielewski's camera, just as the eye slides off the surface of a mask during a kind of Japanese no performance. So it's significant that the Twin Strangers videos all end with Neve and her lookalike, her twin, putting on makeup in an attempt to accentuate their similarities. And they all end with this strange ritual of sitting next to each other, putting on makeup and then posing for the camera. And it's only when they are made up in the same way and assume the same affectless expressions that the uncanny effect of similarity is realized. So twinship here is literally a mask, put on through makeup. And I'm just going to end on this last point. I'm aware that I'm sort of running out of time here. The mask-like quality of twin faces in visual mass culture underscores the disruptive potential of the Face ID videos. And this is the main point I wanted to make about them. So discussing state use of biometric systems during the Occupy movement, the artist and critic Zach Blass argues that the use of masks by protesters, including his main example is the iconic V for Vendetta Guy Fawkes mask, were, this is his phrase, forms of queer illegibility that, and I quote, undermine neoliberal surveillance systems and create amorphous, encrypted, incalculable, excessive, and weird collective stage stylings of bodies and environments. These queer biometric failures, Blass concludes, are utopian oppositions that do not cohere to state visualizations or representations. They evoke facelessness and defacement and make the face a nexus of refusal, collectivization, and potentiality, end quote. So in their Face ID videos, the twin social media stars enact moments of biometric failure. By performing identicalness for the camera, they construct their faces as kind of natural masks that jar with state visualizations. And as the market rushes to exploit the increasing integration between bodies and digital information, twins produce moments of friction that undermine the seamlessness of the interface between humans and computer systems. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Edward. Fascinating. When we read the chapter, we had no idea what a massive thing you were doing with the book. So many aspects of twinship and of post-humanism. Can't wait to see the book. When's the book going to be out for us to buy and read?
Well, I'm supposed to be submitting it in January, but because of the whole COVID situation, I might push that deadline back a little bit to give myself some more time to work on it. I've really been loving working on it. So and this is the chapter that I sent you is the roughest draft of the whole thing. So it'd be really helpful to get some feedback.
What I and the group that when we read, we found it fascinating that there are so many concepts around image or the idea of image or photograph that you have to deal with to go through all this, your argument and understand what you're talking about. So there's optical, post-optical, algorithm, networked, and we were wondering what else you can do with that many, for us, new concepts, right? But my comment, it's not like a question, it's more like a commentary. So I'm going to tell you some of the ideas that came through my mind when we were discussing to see if you if you want to say something about it. So one thing I noticed is my idea of photography and the power of photography has to do with Roland Barthes' phenomenology of photography, from the 60s. So I'm aware that this is old-fashioned, but I remember the idea there was that if you look at it from phenomenology, the idea is photography is really strong because it sort of acts on you. There is like what he calls the punctum, and the fact that you're looking at the photo, but the photo is acting on you. There's an agency. And that's particularly for photographs, as far as I remember, right? And at some point in the chapter, you explain that when you had like analogical photos that were developed chemically and so forth, there was an element of causality there that gets lost with the algorithmic images. I'm not sure it's causality really. Maybe you want to talk about this. I thought it has to do with like a material implication. There's a chemical thing. It's a piece of paper. There's if you look at it in the shade or in the sun, the surface changes. So there's something like I'm trying to get at body. There is body there, which there isn't in these other images, right?
Yeah.
And also, this is one thing. So we wouldn't say it's algorithmic, but we could say that there is something there that acts on the subject, right? And I'm always curious about these effects that you get. This is like what fascinates me the most in the post-human subjectivity is this transition between body and information and body, right? So yeah, the idea is, was there any time when an image that identified us did not somehow include a sort of a performance that's like internal to it? Yeah. Of course, it's not really like an algorithm because you can program it, right? Yeah. But pictures have always been active. And the point now is that we're able to manipulate it. Even if you're not a photographer, you don't know how to develop them. And more than that, you can circulate it and you can post it on the web and whatever and create all sorts of new effects because of that circulation, right? So I don't know, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's one of the things that I was interested in is that the performance of twinship by these social media celebrities emphasizes the tensions within digital image cultures between retaining that punctum-like quality that you're describing, the effective impact of the knowledge that these people were in front of a camera and we were getting an insight into their lives, and the networked logic of the image that circulates and is more about the metadata that is attached to it than the actual image itself. And another example that I didn't discuss just now because I kind of ran out of time was the use of the convention of the selfie by these twin celebrities, because their use of this convention underscores the ambiguities of the genre more generally, which is highly ambiguous, if not kind of contradictory, because on the one hand, it's all about authenticity. It's all about capturing an unprogrammed moment, a sort of authentic moment. And celebrities use it as a device for inviting their followers into their lives, right? So on the one hand, it has this sense of connection to their bodies, literally connection to their bodies, since they're holding the phone at the end of their arms. It's an embodied, highly embodied form of image making. But then the image selfies aren't really about that motion of emotional connection, or at least that's just the spark for their real function, which is that of reproducing networks of information and networks of bodies, connecting information to bodies. So there's something about the twin social media selfies, the kind of twin selfies hashtag that they put it, that it sort of exposes the limitations. It undermines, it both deploys the conventions of the selfie and undermines them. Because obviously the self that they're displaying to the camera is this joined self that is no longer the preserve of one individual, but is transpersonal, is trans-individual, trans-corporeal, right? Which preempts the networks of bodies and information to which they're sending, into which they're sending the image. So yeah, it was that I was really interested in. Not that the effective punctum-like impacts of photography have disappeared, but they're held in tension with this viral logic of intensity, and that's nowhere clearer than in the use of the twin selfie. Yeah.
Fantastic. Right, we got some questions for people watching on YouTube. First one from Gabriela Mafra. Professor King, do you believe technologies could be an instrument to fight against neoliberalism? And if so, how?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, so it's one of the arguments that I ended up making in that chapter is that these twin Face ID videos in which they test this, the security systems used by Apple products, they seem to be the ultimately neoliberal sort of content, right? They're there reviewing consumer products, turning themselves into consumer products as social media influencers. You know, they've literally, it's a form of kind of self-branding, right? But at the same time, they're kind of critiquing that system in a really interesting way. Firstly, the whole idea of like sort of twin celebrities undermines the sort of self-branding reliance on the myth of the individual, right? Because it displaces it. It challenges our understandings about individuality. But then secondly, as I was arguing in the paper, they end up performing this moment of failure within Apple's systems of security, right, which rely on our ideas that are fundamental to capitalist modernity about individualism and human exceptionalism, right? So even though there seems to be the most neoliberal content you could possibly imagine, I'm arguing that they're actually moments of critique. They stage this, they use their twin faces as kind of, like I said, as sort of masks that fox the technology, that produce these moments of kind of strategic invisibility. So for a while, they're not visible from the point of view of these huge commercial entities like Apple and the state. And part of I construct this argument through the excellent work of Zach Blass, and I urge you to go to read his work on masks, because it's based on a number of his artistic projects where he's very interested in the idea of masks as a form of resistance to biometric systems of neoliberal control.
Perfect. I would say resistance is entropy now, right? The way to resist is through entropy. So, and it's funny because in the past you would think uniform bodies, uniform clothes, uniform faces would mean domination, that you're dominated. And right now it's, like you said, it's a strategy for resistance. It's really crazy.
It's a form of camouflage.
So we have another. Yeah, exactly. So we have another question, and then we're going to have a break. So this comes from Mardi Fernandez, and she says, how do acts of strategic invisibility in social media contribute to spreading animosities and many forms of ignorance and social distancing caused by instabilities and uncertainties of human existence?
Yeah, okay, animosity and yeah, so one of the things I've started to think about in relation to this argument is the idea of homophily. I don't know if that's by Wendy Chun, who argues that it's one of the kind of dominant logics of kind of social media culture and datafication more generally, in that it tends to reinforce ghettoization and clear distinctions between different categories and human types, right? The more you interact online, the more things you buy, so on, the more you reinforce your category, and then you're advertised to as a member of that category. And so there's this feedback loop that places you more and more firmly within that social category in distinction from others. And what I was interested in thinking about in this chapter is how twins, the figure of twinship in social media, destabilizes that logic of homophily. And one of the ways I'm interested in thinking about this is going back to the work of Zielewski and his idea of twins as a form of dynamic disequilibrium. So for him, twins aren't the embodiment of this kind of stable dualism, right? Rather, the relationships between twins and their constant forms of mutual entwined becoming are a model for this very unstable undermining of this dynamic undermining of dualisms of all kind. So in a way, even though you'd think that twins would be an emblem of same, would be an emblem of homophily in social media cultures, I'm arguing that they're deployed very interestingly in ways that undermine that logic. And I think that can be seen in one of the examples that I described, which is the Twin Strangers website, where you're asked to upload your face and then it searches the world for a face that looks like yours, and you're forced into this encounter with somebody. And rather than sameness, it's this kind of weird, disjointed sameness that pulls the client, the consumers or whatever, the people who do this, out of themselves in this kind of interesting way, and can't be reducible, I don't think, to what Wendy Chun describes as homophily.
Okay, thank you so much, Edward. You must be tired from talking nonstop.
No, it's been a pleasure.
We're going to have a break now. We're going to have a 10-minute break. And if you want to rest a little bit, take some water. Then we're going to have Paulo and Marcio, and they'd love to see what you have to say or ask about their work. Thank you so much. This was amazing, amazing.
No problem.
Let's stop for 10 minutes, people. Thank you.
Okay.